Welcome back. This is our last video lecture for the course Business, Government, and Society. And this will be our lecture on corporate governance. Corporate governance, okay? So first of all, let's ask the very fundamental question. What is corporate governance? Corporate governance looks at how members of a corporate community exercise authority based on rules, organizational bureaucratic structure, and the processes that link it all together. The authority is kind of divided between shareholders, boards of directors, and managers, but also employees. And so let's go ahead and draw out kind of a sample organization and explain how it all works. I think that'll help quite a bit. So again, who runs an organization? And I'll draw a matrix style organization just for discussion purposes. There are other structures, but at least the matrix one is a pretty easy one to follow. So we got at the top of an organization Chief Executive Officer or CEO. Okay? Now the CEO answers to the Board of Directors. I'll put BOD, Board of Directors. Okay? And the Board of Directors represent the interests of shareholders or owners of the firm. Okay? And every CEO will have their corporate staff. I'll just put a couple, like COO, Chief Operating Officer, CFO, Chief Financial Officer, CTO. It's like your Chief IT person. Sometimes engineering firms have one, CHRO, etc., etc. Okay? So those are going to be your staff. Okay? Then you also have line management. And it varies widely. Those of you that take the sequel to this course with me will explore a little bit more about how these structures work. But you also have line staff, managers of typically strategic business units or subdivisions of an organization that perform a discrete function. So you may have, most strategic business units will have kind of an overall division manager, and then of course these things can go down quite deep. One time I saw an organizational chart that had 35 levels on it. So I've just drawn, 3 here for purposes of illustration. So there's always this tension, right, between the board of directors who represent the interest of shareholders. So shareholders and sometimes the board of directors have different interests. Then there's tension with the CEO. Then there's also tension with the management. Sometimes staff officers can cause problems, and sometimes even employees. So employees, managers, shareholders, board of directors, the CEO, and functional or staff officers can all have very, very different interests and different goals. Yes, true, they should all be representing the interest of the firm or the interest of the shareholders. That's the way it's supposed to be. But again, think back to the theory of forms. Yes, we're going to do what's right. We're going to do what's best for the company. But each of these groups may have very different visions for what is in the best interest of the firm. And that's why we actually have the study of corporate governance, trying to understand this give and take of relationships, this give and take of power. Okay? So let's look at some vocabulary terms here. What's a corporate charter? Okay? A corporate charter is a document that a state government issues to basically create a corporation. It says the state says you are now a bona fide, a certified, a legitimate corporation. And the corporate charters say, well, this is a corporation, it's supposed to do these functions. It says what the rights and duties of stockholders are. Says, what the board of directors will look like, typically the number and the composition on the board, and of course some other things with officers. Okay. Now we also have fiduciary responsibility, and that's the duty of any sort of representative to act as a trustee. Remember we talked about managers as trustees? So fiduciary responsibility means that any one of these actors needs to be operating at all times in the interest of the owner, in the interest of the shareholder. Now, corporate charters will also include large discussion about the number of shares that will be created, the types of stock, whether preferred shares or common stock will be authorized, whether dividends will be paid, what goes on at annual shareholder meetings, again, size and composition of the board, and of course any procedures for removing directors if applicable. And there'll also be bylaws. That's the rules actually adopted by a corporation. Now, states always compete to attract corporations to be incorporated in those states for various reasons, including tax revenues of corporations. So wherever you're incorporated, you may have to pay taxes to that state. Now, Delaware, there's a joke that Delaware actually has more corporations than it does people, because not only is it inexpensive to incorporate in Delaware, Delaware also has laws that aren't necessarily in favor of shareholders, but they tend to be more in favor of management. So Delaware is a great place to incorporate. So in theory, what happens is the federal government, of course, that's going to be way up here. They're the ones that give federal regulations. States interpret that regulation. In accordance with those regulations, states issue a charter. Shareholders are bound by that charter. They give the orders to the board of directors, who gives orders to the CEO, who simultaneously gives orders to his staff and his line managers. Okay, that's what's supposed to happen. What really winds up happening is, the federal and the state, they do issue the charters, but what really happens is the CEO winds up dominating the board of directors, because typically the CEO is also the chairman of the board of directors. And shareholders don't really get any sort of say at all. In fact, they're probably kind of down here. And let's think a little bit about why that might be. Shareholders are a fractious group. Okay? Any of your major corporations on the S&P 500, for example, very few shareholders who own shares of an S&P 500 company will own even more than 1% of the shares. Okay, and shares, of course, are allocated, as voting and stuff. So most shareholders are probably like me, for example. I own 100 shares of this company, 100 shares of that company. Do I have time to read all the stock reports? Do I go to annual shareholder meetings and voice my opinion and ask the CEO questions? No, because I'm a professor and I have this job full time, and I don't have time to do that other thing. So if there's an issue with governance, or the managers aren't behaving properly, or if the CEO is a jerk and I don't like him, do I actually have the time, and is it actually worth my interest to raise a ruckus and try to hold these people accountable? No, especially not if I don't even own $1,000 worth of shares in a given company. Okay, so most shareholders are pretty passive. Now let's say that I knew, man, we got to take care of this CEO. We got to get him fired. We got to, challenge the board of directors. I don't like the direction the company is going in. So what can I do? Well, I can try to pull together with other shareholders and tell them what's going on, but probably they won't care either. Maybe they own $1,000 or $10,000 worth of company shares. They're probably not going to be interested enough to actually raise a ruckus. Okay. Another thing that you can look at is there are activist shareholders, people that own maybe 1, 2, or sometimes even as high as 5% of a company's stock. But again, that's usually not enough for them to cast any sort of majority vote. That's not usually anything more for them to actually cause, other than maybe a little bit of a protest or something. I've been investing in my retirement accounts and buying shares for a good 5-6 years. I've never voted in a general election of a corporation. I've never been to an annual shareholder meeting. I don't have time. Okay, so the shareholders, because we're so divisive, we're such a fractured group, it pretty much means that we kind of have to trust the CEO, the board of directors, and the managers to do what's in our best interest. Corporate governance laws typically remain in the domain of individual states, but if things get too out of hand, Congress can intervene, especially if there is a particularly conspicuous failure. Think of the Enron Group, and we'll actually talk about that one in class. So right now, I'm going to wrap up this video, and then we'll continue with some of the regulation governing corporate governance, and also some of the duties of directors and a few other things when we get back.